We've got some breaking news this morning over on Capitol Hill. The House will vote on a motion to vacate the speakership put forward by Freedom Caucus rabble-rouser Matt Gaetz later today. Gaetz and Speaker Kevin McCarthy split over McCarthy's alleged reneging on his pledge to put an end to, quote, blank checks to Ukraine. Gaetz called out the House Speaker on the floor yesterday. Let's watch that.
So let me get this straight. To extend Joe Biden's spending and Joe Biden's policy priorities, the Speaker of the House gave away to Joe Biden the money for Ukraine that Joe Biden wanted. It is going to be difficult for my Republican friends to keep calling President Biden feeble while he continues to take Speaker McCarthy's lunch money in every negotiation. What commitments were made to President Biden to continue the spending of President Biden in exchange for doing things for President Biden? It is becoming increasingly clear who the Speaker of the House already works for, and it's not the Republican conference. Members of the Republican Party might vote differently on a motion to vacate if they heard what the Speaker had to share with us about his secret side deal with Joe Biden on Ukraine. I'll be listening. Stay tuned, and I yield back.
Here's McCarthy responding to the news.
Expecting Democrats to back you up then?
No, I personally am not.
Do you need their help to remain in leadership?
No. If five Republicans go with Democrats, then I'm out.
Now, McCarthy has declined to confirm whether he'd cut a deal with Democrats to potentially save his speakership. However, it seems many Democrats may jump at the opportunity to oust McCarthy while they can.
This is a tragic tale of a weak, pathetic man who, in order to achieve his wish of being a speaker, had to make a deal with the devil. And we are not interested in saving this man from himself and the devil that he made this deal with. It is true that he made all of these promises, including what is now risking his speakership. He brought this onto himself. And if he was somebody who had a backbone, who knew how to lead, who wasn't a known liar, maybe some of us would consider what it means for the integrity of his speakership to try to stop this chaos. But the reality is, this is the chaos their conference wanted.
Now, apparently, there is one way out. McCarthy can move to table Gaetz' resolution, and that would effectively kill it. But I do believe that he needs support from Democrats for that as well. What do you make of the calculation that Democrats, including progressives like Ilhan Omar, are making right now as they consider whether or not to, I guess, go with the devil they know versus the devil they don't know in McCarthy's replacement?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Are we going to get someone that's better than McCarthy by supporting the motion to vacate? I think Hakeem Jeffries might go for it, but might be motivated by his potential for being the speaker. If they end up voting in a new speaker, 5 Republicans go with the Democrats. If they end up getting Hakeem Jeffries in the speakership role, I think Matt Gaetz would also be put in a tough position because he criticized McCarthy for aligning himself with Biden. Is having Hakeem Jeffries in the role of speaker better than having a McCarthy who's aligned with Biden? Similarly, if you're a progressive in the House, are you going to be, happy to have a motion to vacate if we end up getting a Republican that's less likely to work with Democrats altogether? There's a lot of calculations that need to be made, and I think a lot of the decision making will happen in conversations we'll never know the substance of. We saw a lot of this on C-SPAN because this vote that took 15 tries to get McCarthy in that position, we're able to see a lot of what was going on the floor of Congress. I think the most interesting outcome of this is we see both parties fracture along the lines of establishment and along the lines of who's on the more populist wing of the party. I think that's really the most fascinating outcome. But I can really see Hakeem Jeffries going for this because he's interested in power and becoming the not majority leader. He would still be, in the minority, but potentially securing the speakership. I don't think the Republicans are going to ultimately go for that.
So, the likelihood of Hakeem Jeffries becoming Speaker is almost nil because that would require Republicans crossing the line and voting affirmatively for McCarthy. You know, some mooting out what can happen. You can get a majority of the House to vote to table the resolution, which again effectively kills it. But that means that if you take the Freedom Caucus out of it, which obviously they're the ones that are driving this motion to vacate in the first place, means that you would need 4 Democrats to cross the aisle and agree to table this motion to vacate. Now, that is a lot less politically toxic, I would argue, than actually voting affirmatively for Kevin McCarthy as a Democrat. So I do think that that is a more likely option than some alternatives. I do think that while some of what Matt Gaetz was saying on the clip we played earlier comes off as grandstanding, and certainly establishment Republicans have been making the case that he is in this in a self-interested way, that all he cares about is fundraising, that all he cares about is raising his own personal profile and not the interests of the party. I do think there's something useful for the public in seeing that there's a core truth to what he's saying about the fact that as much as Republicans, generally speaking, grandstand about the differences between them and Democrats when it comes to funding and the deficit, historically, Republicans have driven up the deficit. Trump's tax cuts added $1.7 trillion to the deficit. And at the end of the day, most Republicans are willing to make compromises with the Democratic Party to continue to fund the government at pre-existing levels, most especially around military spending, which, as we all know, takes up a disproportionate chunk of our spending overall. And so even though he might also be self-interested, there is something I think very interesting about him forcing a conversation about the massive identity of interest in spending choices that both wings of the party make, only to pop up periodically during election seasons and say, well, the conservatives are cutting child poverty, and the conservatives say, well, the Democrats want to fund trans schools or whatever it is, when on the big ticket issues that really matter. You know, frankly, funding the border, Biden has largely kept Trump's border policy intact. Military intervention, the military-industrial complex is a two-winged bird. One wing is Democrats and one wing is Republican. That is really exposing how little differences there are on some of these big-ticket items.
Yeah, I think that's very true, especially now that we see a growing anti-war faction of the Republican Party, you know, specifically because of, I think, the war in Ukraine has really been the nexus of that, seeing how much money is going to Ukraine at a time when so many Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. I think that calls into question this notion of America first that we heard under Trump that is now a tenet of that faction of the Republican Party. I think that makes it more likely that we see potentially the Freedom Caucus working with progressives to cut into some of the defense spending we've seen. That's ridiculous. I do think you're right that it's more likely that we have 4 Democrats come over and go with the motion to, I think, suspend or table. Because they can make this argument that, oh, well, we don't want to get into all of this. We have more important things to focus on. We have to focus on, you know, budgeting around the shutdown. They can easily make that case. It's going to be much easier for them to strategize for 4 Democrats to support that. And I think you're right, than for them to vote in explicit support of McCarthy. It allows them to control the narrative like they usually do in a very establishment fashion of, we have a very reasonable reason for doing this. It's not that we support, you know, the status quo. It's just that we want to get down to business and this is a waste of time. Yeah, I can totally see them going with that kind of messaging, but I would much rather see them really grapple with the budget in a meaningful way. Time and again, we have chairmen of the Federal Reserve that are conservative, that explain in very clear terms that the economic constraints of spending are whether or not it will cause inflation. Public spending in the direction of increasing economic productivity is entirely justified. Them defining the constraints on spending as this arbitrary number that is the debt limit, them believing that we always need to issue debt and government bonds in order to public spend is something that was called into question during the first COVID stimulus when they simply voted to spend dollars. They have the power of the purse. They just simply are too lazy to make the economic calculations, and also are bought and sold by America's corporate interests, so that instead they're spending in the direction of the status quo instead of pursuing things that I think working people would really like, which is rebuilding infrastructure. Biden's infrastructure plan was a step in the right direction. We obviously need something more, like a Green New Deal. Energy prices are a big problem. We've seen people consider addressing food deserts by having municipal grocery stores. There's a lot of ideas that will actually increase productivity and increase GDP and justify the initial cost of public spending. They're budgeting entirely wrong. And it's time for them, I think, the progressive wing, to have that conversation. We can't keep doing this over and over again. And I think potentially we could get the Freedom Caucus on board with that a little bit now that they're in support of some defense spending cuts. A lot of them talk about fiscal responsibility, but in the wrong way.
I mean, I don't want to lose sight of what the debates were about coming from Republicans as a caucus around the government shutdown. There was a proposal to cut funding to low-income Title I schools by 80%. So I don't want to do any false equivalencies here between the kinds of budget priorities that Democrats are articulating versus Republicans. Those kind of policies that Republicans were pushing for aren't even popular among the Republican base. I also don't want to be overly sanguine about the likelihood of any of these progressives crossing the aisle and offering support for the Freedom Caucus with respect to lowering aid to Ukraine. We saw Bernie Sanders, I think, disappoint a lot of progressives coming out with a tweet basically saying we're going to find a way to continue to support Ukraine regardless of the nature of the continuing resolution. So there's a lot of wrong and blame to be spread across the board. I just want to also note that one other way that Democrats could kind of hack this is by, without having to affirmatively vote to protect Kevin McCarthy, is to vote present. And by voting present, they lower the total number of votes Kevin McCarthy needs to save him by lowering the total so it's easier for him to get to a majority. So there are many ways for Democrats to get out of this without having to affirmatively support Kevin McCarthy, but they will be tacitly supporting him. And there is still this question of whether or not they feel like they are better situated with Kevin McCarthy, who we can see how he's been trying to negotiate with the Democrats and be a middleman between them and the Freedom Caucus, or whoever would run Congress in the interim, who is chosen by Kevin McCarthy, so likely someone who's aligned, or whoever would ultimately get nominated over successive rounds, the way we saw back in January, who may or may not be someone who is even less conciliatory, shall we say, than Kevin McCarthy himself. All right.
Yeah, my dreams for the progressives hardly ever come true, for them using their power to actually change things and do things good. And my interest in the Freedom Caucus actually governing in the direction of helping American people is also a dream that I don't anticipate to come true.
Yeah, well, a dream deferred. All right, stick around. More Rising right after this.